Welcome back to my How to Become an IFA series, and today we're covering R03, Personal Taxation. So we're on the third exam of the RO series. I have to say I actually put this exam off until the penultimate one. I did all the others and I left R03 till last because I just thought taxation was going to be the most daunting thing I ever did. But when I actually came to do it, I did actually find it quite straightforward. So it's up to you when you want to do this. As I've said before, you don't have to do it as the third exam. You can do them in whatever order you want, except R06 should be done last. Now, R03 is about taxation, so you're digging into the UK taxation system, how you analyse taxation. There'll be a lot of calculations here that you need to learn as well, and I'll go through some more detail of those in a moment. But this focuses mainly on individuals and the taxation of trusts. Now, tax is a really big one, as you probably well know already. Tax has a big impact on your earnings, the tax you pay on your savings, any gains that you have in terms of investments or assets. So it really is quite a broad area. But saying that, there are actually only 4 syllabus outcomes and 4 learning outcomes, which is quite difficult because it means they're rather broad. But I'll just run through those quickly now before we get stuck further into R03. So learning outcome number 1 is understand the UK tax system as relevant to the needs and circumstances of individuals and trusts. That is 15 standard format questions. Learning outcome number 2, analyse the taxation of investments as relevant to the needs and circumstances of individuals and trusts. That is 8 standard format questions and 7 multiple response questions. I'll cover the difference between those types of questions in a moment. Number 3, analyse the role and relevance of tax in the financial affairs of individuals and trusts. That is 6 standard format questions and 4 multiple response questions. And number 4 is to apply the knowledge of personal taxation to the provision of investment advice, and that is 10 standard format questions. It's worth saying this is a 50 question exam with 1 hour allocated to it, and there will be 39 standard format questions and 11 multiple response questions. So we'll just pause for a moment and just discuss the difference between a standard format and a multiple response format question. Apologies if you've seen my R02 and my R01 exam videos, because I have already covered this, but this is for those of you who perhaps haven't seen those and just want a bit more clarification. So a standard format question has 1 question and 4 or 5 possible answers, and only 1 of those answers is correct. Most of the questions in the exam will be standard format questions, and you will get notified throughout the exam when you're getting to the multiple response ones, because the multiple response ones are slightly different. With a multiple response question, you have 1 question and you get 4 or 5 options, but more than 1 of those options will be right. But it is always more than 1 and is never all of the options. So you're probably looking at about 3 to 5 of the options that are given to you are going to be the right answers to the question. Sometimes they tell you how many answers are correct. Sometimes they don't, so it's quite tricky. I mean, these are really tricky questions. The multiple response ones are the toughest ones, so it helps to practice them the most, because you just have to do it by a process of elimination and to try and work out what they're asking you. But do make sure you read the questions more than once with the multiple response ones, because every part of the question will impact which ones are the correct answers. So just be thorough when you're reading them. I'll go more into some study tips and some exam tips in a moment, but I'm just going to go a bit deeper into what R03 is actually going to cover and what you'll know when you've completed it. So as I said, there'll be a lot of calculations, so you'll be able to do calculations relating to inheritance tax, investment tax, personal allowance, ISA contributions, all those sorts of things. I'll go through towards the end of the video. I'll tell you probably the calculations that are likely to come up, because they tend to come up with the same or similar ones almost every time. So hopefully that will help you know where to focus your knowledge. And R03 is a core unit for the diploma in financial planning. So whether you're doing the diploma in regulated financial planning or you need to top up your knowledge for the diploma in financial planning, R03 is one of the core units. So let's dig into some study tips. So as I said before, there are only 4 syllabus areas, which means they're quite broad. So although the textbook might look quite slim and quite appealing, there is a lot of content in terms of taxation and calculations. So it's one you're really going to have to get stuck into and really learn the calculations off by heart. You will have the textbook that you can obviously read through, and you'll be given Revision Mate automatically when you purchase the textbook. So Revision Mate is a really good kind of accompaniment to your textbook, and it can help with, there are some sort of tests that you can take at the end of each chapter, some knowledge tests that will be multiple choice, and you can also download some past papers so you can have a go under time conditions, which I would recommend, of doing the multiple choice questions. So give yourself an hour, work your way through it and see how you do. It's definitely worth practicing as many past papers as you can, so you get used to the style of the CII exams, and so you know the way the CII are likely to word things. Sadly, I found that perhaps the Revision Mate self-test questions at the end of chapters they can be helpful, but they're not really worded in the same way as the CII exams are. So if you can get your hands on some past practice papers, that is really helpful, because you'll start to see the pattern of how the CII tend to ask you questions and things that you should look out for, and that would apply to the questions that you need to answer. As I've said before, it's all about working out what type of studying works best for you, whether that's passive learning in terms of reading, but more commonly it tends to be things such as doing past papers, writing things down, listening to audiobooks, anything like that. Just study best for you, and it's also the quality of your study and not the quantity of your study. There's no point just reading reams and reams of textbooks if you're not actually soaking any of it in. If you're more of a hands-on learner, then make sure you're doing the right sort of learning style that is right for you. Now, there will be lots of calculations, as I said before. You will actually be given tax tables when you get into the exam. These can be really helpful because they'll give you all the tax percentages for the current tax year, so you don't necessarily have to learn all of them off by heart before you go in. But just a word of warning that this is very time limited in the exam, so it's 1 hour for 50 questions, but just bear in mind that if you're trying to fumble through a tax table to try and find out what tax percentages you need to apply to a calculation, that will slow down your response time. So just the more you learn before you go in, the better, and if you can store away as much tax information as you can in terms of percentages and allowances that apply, it will make your response time to questions quicker, so you'll be able to do the calculations quicker and choose hopefully the correct answer. But just bear that in mind, the tax tables will be there if you want sort of a backup, or you just need to check something. Let's move on to exam tips then. So I have banged on about calculations plenty over the past few minutes, but R03 is not all about calculations. Only about 10 to 20% of the exam are likely to be calculation questions. And also, because there's such a time limit on the exam, you're not going to be asked to do complex, long questions to work out which one's going to be correct. They should be relatively straightforward in terms of calculations they'll ask you to do. But they might ask you to do part of a calculation. For example, they might ask you to calculate someone's taxable income rather than the tax they will pay on their whole income, and things like that, because there are very different ways that they can word things in the exam. So just bear that in mind when you're reading a question, and make sure you do the right calculation for the question they're asking you, not the question you think they're asking you. That's going to be quite an easy trap to fall into. So although I've only said 10 to 20% of the questions are likely to be calculations, there are some key calculations that are likely to come up in your exam, and those will be investment bond taxation, onshore and offshore, income tax, which might include tapering of the personal allowance, so that's something to watch out for, the use of the dividend allowance and the personal savings allowance, inheritance tax, including the 36% rate, and capital gains tax. So those are areas that you really need to make sure you know. As well as the calculation questions, the rest of the exam will be made up of theory-based questions, but that doesn't mean they won't include calculations. They can include questions on VCTs and EISs, and there will also likely be a question of how much a family can contribute into an ISA. But there is a key here, and that is to make sure you know the ages of the children in these questions, because the 16-year-old can obviously hold a cash ISA and a junior ISA. So make sure you know the ages of the children in the family that they're asking you about, and the allowances for the particular types of ISAs that they can hold. And do watch out for the way a question is asked. It can seem quite complicated, but just try and break it down, work out what is actually being asked of you, the key elements to the question, and then that should help you lead you to the correct answer or answers if it's a multiple response question. The exam itself is a 1 hour exam, 50 multiple choice questions, so that's 72 seconds per question. That might not seem like a lot, so if you can learn as much of the taxation table before you go in, you will be able to respond to questions quicker. Now, the 2020 pass rate was only 65%, and in 2019 it was actually only 56%, so it is one of the tougher exams, although as I said, I actually found it easier because I did it later on in the series of RO exams, but that's entirely up to you when you want to do it. Because it's only a 1 hour exam, there are only 10 credits available, but that doesn't mean it's easy. So study hard and you'll be fine. I hope that's helpful, guys. Come back in a couple of months and I'll be diving into R04.